Born a Cunnamulla girl in 1944, Joy Stapleton spent her childhood either on sheep stations or schooling in Wyandra, the second of 11 children to Blanche and Alan. Mum always loved the fact that she was part of a huge family with 8 sisters and 2 brothers. Mum loved practically sharing her birthday with my eldest brother Jimmy and never let him forget that she left her 21st birthday party to give birth. He was born the next day, November 16th. I'm so glad Joy and Doug recently celebrated her 77th birthday in style at a masquerade party hosted by Jimmy with a string quartet, a band who sang Mum happy birthday, and bright colours, sparkles, feathers, sequins and masks as far as the eye could see. Joy especially loved her grandma on her mum Blanche's side, her grandma who we lovingly called Rubbish. Since one day she said to my brother Tootie, "Hello, David," and he said, "If you call me David, I will call you Rubbish." She loved Rubbish's cheeky sense of humour, her stories and candour, her zest for life, her ability to live life the way she chose, a bit of a rebel. So when a young Joy was at university, she took up smoking only because ladies weren't allowed. A habit I'm glad to say she stopped decades ago. Mum did everything to the best of her ability and loudly. Speaking, singing, laughing, sneezing, fashion. Her mum once tried to get her to sneeze like a lady, and she remembered nearly blowing her eardrums out, and she thought she'd never do that again. Mum loved to sing. When she was in Subaru College, she was in the choir. The nuns, however, discovered her lack of tone, pitch, whatever it is that makes singing great. She didn't have it. They refused to let her not be in the choir, but she was only allowed to mouth the words. One of her favourite songs to belt out to show off her vocal range was Chic of Scrubby Creek, which she performed with gusto at Carmel's wedding in Thailand, much to Carmel's horror. Funnily enough, the singing voice also runs in the family. Around Australia, if Mum's sisters were singing at a random wedding, funeral, baptism, church service, they've been mistaken for each other by their singing. Or perhaps that family laugh. My Stapleton cousins and I would sit outside at family parties, laughing like hyenas, making fun of the hilarity of the aunts inside. Mum's laugh was a force of nature. Joy has supported just about every Bedesset play ever. I was in South Pacific in grade 7, my first musical with the Bedesset Amateur Musical Society, BAMS. Everyone knew if Joy was in the audience, it was going to be a great night. When I was in high school, Joy, as town councillor and enthusiastic sponsor of the arts, invited the Melbourne Philharmonic Orchestra to Bedesset, a show that included comedy and mimes. The mime was releasing ping pong balls magically from his mouth at the same time as going back on a 45-degree angle. Quite a feat. And Mum was laughing so hard in the front row that the mime swallowed a ball, stood up, leaned forward and looked her in the eye to see who was making that noise. Mum not only was a massive supporter for the arts in our beautiful scenic Brim, she was an artist in her own right. She created outfits, jewellery, paintings, many other types of artwork and craft. She published bush poetry, short stories, columns for the newspaper over decades. But if she wrote her eulogy, we couldn't find it. A flamboyant mother, she lived her life in the only way she knew how, to the fullest. As a kid, having Joy as a mum was challenging and entertaining, funny and a bit embarrassing sometimes, but there was no doubt she was loved. Her brightly coloured clothing, hats, spider-themed outfits, witch costumes, jewellery with frogs, scorpions, cats and peacocks all made their way into her wardrobe over the years. I was always impressed with her jewellery collection. As her skills grew in jewellery making using bone and horn with silver and pewter, she loved the textures and colours of nature as part of her collections and would proudly tell the stories of her pieces. Given how much public speaking Joy has done, many of you may not believe that there was a time when Mum couldn't speak in front of a crowd. I was in grade 6 when Mum first joined a Toastmistress club in Beaudesert. She would close her eyes or look at the roof. Audiences terrified her. Hard to imagine. Mum and Eileen Healy started on the same night, the inaugural meeting. They were both so nervous that when they were asked to introduce themselves, they struggled to find the words. Mum was so excited about starting in the Toastmasters Club that she turned up a whole month early. If you know Mum at all, you'll know that she was rarely on time. The Toastmasters Club became ITC, became Power Talk, which she loved till her very last day. In 1979, she won her first election as town councillor. Over the next 3 decades, she spent 3 as councillor and 2 as mayor, having the distinction of being both the first female mayor of Bedesset and the last mayor of Bedesset Shire before being renamed Scenic Rim. Mum's life was about people, friendships, community, but most of all family. Mum and my dad, Terry Sheil, gave Jimmy, David, Carmel and I our childhood in Bedesset. We were married for 25 years before he passed away. Mum's now been married to Doug for 30 plus years, and she well and truly changed his life. When they married, he'd never been north of Noosa, west of Toowoomba or south of Tweed Heads. And now they've travelled the globe, including trips to China, Canada, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, USA, and cruising the Mediterranean, Greece and Alaska. When not overseas, you'd find them old-time dancing or at their favourite Chinese restaurant. Doug's been a phenomenon keeping up with Mum all these years. If you've read Mum's nightly blogs on Facebook, you'll know how filled her days could be. And of course, being an insomniac for most of her life allowed her to fit more into her day than most people. Indeed, on Mum and Doug's last day together, they made their way into Brisbane by 8:30 for a Power Talk meeting in which Mum competed and came second in an Australia-wide speech competition for a speech on happiness, where ironically she started with, "Today is the happiest day of your life. How do I know? Because you are alive." They travelled back to Bedesset for the Freedom Rally at Jubilee Park, where Mum gave an impromptu speech, hugged 500 people, dropped in for coffee with her friend Trish, went out to dinner at the Chinese and shopped afterwards. What a day, but not uncommon for Mum. I think back on all of the clubs and committees she's been a part of over the years. There's no way of mentioning them all. Bad Cap and LMP, Doug and Mum working tirelessly for the Bedesset Steam Train, Rotary and their Sunday morning coffee with cars, the Historical Society and the yearly Shepherd's Walk, supporting fundraising for just about anything and everything and spreading her love and help around to anybody who needed it. She was a great mum who supported us all in anything we ever wanted to do. Like hubby and I getting our motorbike licences a few years ago, she said, "That's terrific." Mum proudly loved her whole huge crazy family. So Joy Stapleton, Sheil, Drescher, the girl from Cunnamulla, one of a kind, blossomed from her humble beginnings to a woman who's touched so many people's lives. Joy, you are an inspiration.
I'm not good with public speaking, so if I look at the roof or somewhere. So Urban Dictionary defines Joy as a wonderful woman who makes a great friend. If you've ever gained her trust, which everyone does, when around her, nothing bad can happen to you. She loves her friends and family very much, and when you first